There are a couple of ingenious mechanisms that plants have to limit their water loss. Again, I mentioned this during the last lecture, but water loss is a serious problem for plants because they have to have their stomata open in order to exchange gases for photosynthesis and for respiration. Um, the problem is that those little open stomata leak water. And that's why those 500 pounds of water in a full-size maple tree need to be replaced every hour, is because there's a tremendous amount of water loss. If a plant is growing in an environment where it's tough to get 500 pounds of water an hour, it greatly favors that plant if it has some mechanism for shutting its stomata as often as possible. There are a couple of different, really kind of clever adaptations that plants have evolved in order to keep their stomata shut at least as much as possible and at least during the heat of the day. Some plants, particularly desert plants, are what are called crassulacean acid metabolism plants, or CAM plants for short. What these plants do is they actually open their stomata at night. Photosynthesis cannot happen at night, but it's cooler then, so there's less water loss. What the plants do is they pull carbon dioxide in and they attach it to an organic acid, which is then moved inside the plant. It either moves spatially or temporally. In CAM plants, what happens is the organic acid is simply stored up in the leaves, and then in the daytime, when there's light energy available, the stomata shut, so there's no water loss, and the plants basically reverse this chemical reaction. The CO2 is split away from the organic acid. It's used in the Calvin cycle to ultimately to make glucose, and the organic acid is recycled to pick up more CO2 in the following night. What this means, basically, is that the plant can do photosynthesis during the hot parts of the day without opening its stomata, and this saves it a tremendous amount of water. The other adaptation that many plants have evolved, and these are more widespread, the C4 plants include things like grasses, such as grains. C4 plants do a similar thing, except instead of moving photosynthesis in time, they're moving it in space. They bring CO2 in. The CO2 is added to another chemical compound, and then that chemical compound is shuttled to a different place in the plant. So it's used to make organic acids, and those organic acids are then moved deeper within the plant, where the CO2 is released. The CO2 is then used to make glucose in the usual way. Now, all of this is happening during the day while the sun is shining, and it's presumably warmer than usual. So you might be asking yourself, well, how does this allow for the plant to avoid losing water? What this does is it essentially artificially concentrates the amount of CO2 near the enzymes that will use that CO2 to make glucose. It speeds up the Calvin cycle. Okay, Rubisco is the enzyme that fixes carbon here, and it is the rate-limiting step in photosynthesis. If you can drive this particular step faster by increasing the concentration of CO2, you make photosynthesis more efficient. And if you make photosynthesis more efficient, it basically speeds up the rate at which you're pulling in carbon dioxide, and that means that you can have your stomata open for shorter amounts of time. In other words, you can meet your CO2 needs in a shorter amounts of time because it's being pulled in faster. That means you can spend more time with those stomata shut. So that's the movement of water up from a plant. You've got root loading in the xylem, and you've got the cohesion tension mechanisms lifting water up the plant passively. Sorry, it's root pressure, not root loading. We're about to talk about loading in the context of the movement of phloem. To understand what's going on here with the movement of phloem, I need to introduce the idea of sources and sinks. A source is a place in a plant where sucrose is being generated, where sugar is being made. Of course, this is where photosynthesis is happening. Other parts of the plant where there's not so much photosynthesis are called sinks. They need sugar in order to survive, but they're not making it. So in other words, a source is where the sugar is made. A sink is where more of it is being consumed than being made. And of course, sugar has to move from source to sink in order for all of this to happen, in order for all the parts of the plant to stay alive. It's worth mentioning that which tissues are sources and which tissues are sinks varies depending on the time of year. Obviously, in the growing season, sites of photosynthesis are the sources, and everything else is a sink, particularly places where the plant is growing. However, what plants will often do is they'll shuttle a lot of sucrose, a lot of sugars, to storage places in the plant where those sugars are condensed into starch molecules. Early in the growing season, what will then happen in the spring is those starch molecules get converted back into sugar, and that storage organ then becomes a source. The whole rest of the plant at that point is a sink. So where the sources and sinks are depends on what time of year or what time in the growing season you're talking about. There are a couple of different mechanisms that plants use to move sugar through the phloem. One of them is what's called phloem loading. I mentioned in the last lecture that the sieve tube members are these cells that have basically become completely hollow. They make up the vessels that allow phloem to move throughout the plant. Each one of these sieve tube members is accompanied by a companion cell. And these are the companion cells have the usual cellular machinery. They're not hollow and empty the way that the sieve tube members are. And they carry out the various different functions, both for themselves and for the sieve tube members, that both these cells need in order to establish themselves. Leaf cells actively, sucrose or sugar is actively transported across the boundary between a leaf cell and the companion cell that is right next to a phloem element. This does require ATP, by the way. It's not one of the passive mechanisms. And as you might imagine, what it does is it lowers the water potential inside the companion cell. The sucrose, basically, eventually what happens is the companion cell gets so full of water that it can't get more full. And then the sucrose, as it builds up in this cell, will start moving by diffusion out into the phloem vessel next door. This increases the water potential within the phloem, and that draws water across from the xylem. So you've got a strong negative solute potential here in the companion cell and here in the phloem, which draws water across and then generates a high pressure potential within the phloem. This is the same thing as what we're talking about happening in the roots when the xylem gets loaded up with nutrients. That generates a pressure potential, a high pressure potential, that tends to push fluids along the system of vessels that run throughout the plant. At the other end, at any place that is a sink, what's happening is that the cells are taking up sucrose. And again, they can do this generally with active transport. This, in turn, pulls sucrose out of the companion cells. Of course, that generates a gradient of sucrose that pulls sucrose out of the phloem. And as that happens, it increases the solute potential until finally the solute potential in the phloem is actually higher than the solute potential in the neighboring xylem. When this point is reached, water is naturally going to be drawn to the lower solute potential over in the xylem, and so it moves out of this phloem. That creates a vacuum that pulls phloem down the vessels from the sources to the sinks. And this mechanism is really pretty nifty because apart from the act of transport, it works automatically. A cell that is generating lots of sucrose just needs to pump its sucrose out into the nearby companion cells. A cell that needs sucrose just needs to pump sucrose in from nearby companion cells. And the long distance transport then just happens automatically through the phloem. Because the phloem loading and unloading generates the pressure potentials that are necessary to move fluid through the phloem. This is called bulk transport, the movement of sap, essentially, through the phloem. And this is how plants kind of ingeniously and automatically get sugar from where it's being made to where it's needed.